Hi everyone, and welcome to Fully Charged Super 7, Science and Strategies to Skyrocket Social, Emotional, and Cognitive Skills in the Young Brain. I'm Julie Adams, and I'm so glad that you are here with me today. My journey into neuroscience started with a quick interaction with one of my students. He turned to me and said, "Mrs. Adams, nobody wakes up to suck." Now, let me explain. I was a classroom teacher for 14 years, with the bulk of those years at the middle school level. And one day I was teaching 8th grade a US history lesson, and we were analyzing primary source documents. And one of my students, who I will call Brian, he was struggling with the lesson. And he said to me, "Mrs. Adams, this is really hard. I don't get it. Can you help me?" And I made the flippant comment to him, "Brian, just try a little bit harder, read them one more time. I'm sure it will all click and make perfect sense." And that's when he turned to me and rocked my world. And he said, "Mrs. Adams, nobody wakes up to suck. I know that all of you teachers probably think I like to fail my classes and fight with everybody, but I don't. Every morning when I wake up, I pray that I can be successful. And before I know it, I'm struggling and things are going downhill and I'm getting into trouble. So can you please help me be successful?" Now, the problem was as a new teacher, I did not have the knowledge and skills to help Brian socially, emotionally, and cognitively. But that set me out on a journey to learn everything I could about neuroscience and critical thinking, and really, what are the secrets to success? Why do some people seem to have the skills and knowledge and some people don't? But more importantly, can we teach the knowledge and skills that it takes to increase social, emotional, and cognitive success? So I studied everything I could about neuroscience and critical thinking and literacy and engagement and vocabulary acquisition and note-taking and the secrets to success. And guess what? It all boils down to a couple neuroscientific principles. And when I went back and implemented those principles into my lessons, not only did behavioral issues subside, but social, emotional, and cognitive success with all of my students increased drastically. So I want to share those 3 NeuroNuggets with you right now. Number 1, the young brain is different. Repeat after me. The young brain is different. Number 2, the brain, especially the young brain, is highly influenced by environment. And the 3rd neuroscientific principle or nugget that is important for us to understand as educators is success is not by chance, but by design. And Brian was asking me the million-dollar question, "Mrs. Adams, can you design an environment that will increase my success?" And the good news is, once we have the knowledge and skills, we can absolutely do it. And I'm going to share some insight with you right here. Our essential question is, how does the young brain differ from the mature brain? And what are 7 strategies to skyrocket social, emotional, cognitive skills? Now, take a couple seconds here and think. Activate your prior knowledge. And if you had to answer this question right now, based on your own experience, what are 1 or 2 things you would say about it? All right, we'll come back to the essential question a little bit later. Here are our 3 neuroscientific principles that are so important for educators to keep in mind when we are lesson planning, designing classroom management routines, and trying to build positive relationships with our students. The young brain is different. The brain, especially the young brain, is highly influenced by environment, and success is not by chance, but by design. And that's the million-dollar question that Brian was asking me. "Mrs. Adams, can you design an environment that can increase my success?" And guess what? Neuroscience says, yes, we can. Okay, so let's tackle that first NeuroNugget principle. The young brain is different. One major way the young brain is different is it has an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex or executive functioning center. Let me explain. In the last 20 years, neuroscientists have discovered far more about the young brain than ever before because they have fancy cognitive equipment, such as MRIs, PET scans, and QEEGs. And what they've discovered is that the brain develops from the stem forward. And the last part of the brain to develop is usually this area right here, the prefrontal cortex. Now, it's responsible for many skills, but 5 skills that I want to point out right here that are important to us to understand as educators. The first is cause and effect analysis, or causal connection. What this means is for every action, there's a reaction, and the young brain tends to struggle with that concept a little bit. And that's why when little Johnny or Jenny does something stupid and we say, "Hey, Johnny, why'd you make that bad choice?" What does little Johnny always say? "I don't know." And we think he's being sassy, but he's not. He's being brutally honest. He's like, "Hey, look, I don't know. I got nothing. I don't know why I made that bad choice." That's important for us to keep in mind. Don't commit a suicide and assume a child knows why he made a bad choice. Many times, that underdeveloped prefrontal cortex is not explaining it to him. Another skill of the prefrontal cortex is emotional regulation. That's why the young brain tends to be very drama-filled and up and down with emotions. Another skill is impulse control. Another skill of the prefrontal cortex that students often struggle with is organization. 2 types of organization. The first is explicit organization. That is, for example, how to organize my math binder so I can find my homework and turn it in. And they also tend to struggle with implicit organization, which is abstract thinking, such as how should I organize my thoughts in my persuasive paragraph so I can identify my claim and supporting evidence and get you to agree with me. They tend to struggle with that a little bit as well. And then the 5th skill of the prefrontal cortex that I want to make sure that we're really paying attention to and so that we understand some of the things that students struggle with is rational decision making. So cause and effect analysis, emotional regulation, impulse control, organization, both explicit and implicit, and rational decision making. Now, the good news is that we can accelerate healthy brain development and build those prefrontal cortex executive functioning skills by explicitly teaching strategies. And so I want to share 7 powerful strategies to increase social, emotional, and cognitive skills right now. Before we jump into the 7 strategies, let's review our NeuroNuggets again. The young brain is different. It has an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex and often struggles with cause and effect analysis, emotional regulation, impulse control, organizational skills, and rational decision making. Let's talk for a moment about the second neuroscientific principle. The brain, or the young brain, is highly influenced by environment. What do we mean by that? Well, every morning we wake up with a rechargeable battery, our brain. Some of us wake up fully charged, some of us wake up drained. What does it take to wake up fully charged? Well, we have to trigger positive chemical reactions that charge up our battery. You might have heard this saying before, you gotta Maslow before you can bloom. That's actually the fully charged motto that my co-authors, Dr. PJ Kaposi and Dr. Rosa Isaiah, talk about in our book, Fully Charged. Let me explain it though, because it applies to us as well as to our students. So when we meet Maslow needs, now you've probably seen the Maslow's pyramid hierarchy of basic needs many times. But if you look at the hierarchy, at the bottom, our basic physiological needs are we need food, water, warmth, and rest. When we get those needs met, that triggers positive chemical reactions such as oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins, and it decreases our cortisol, which drains us. But it charges us up with powerful battery charging chemicals, those oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins. And then we get a little bit of battery charge. And then when we feel safe and secure, which is the next level of Maslow's hierarchy, that also triggers positive chemical reactions that charge up our battery. And then when we feel positively connected and we have a sense of belonging, which is the third level of Maslow's pyramid, that charges us up by increasing positive chemical reactions. And then the fourth level of Maslow's pyramid is when we receive explicit instruction and skill development, and then we have an opportunity to model and demonstrate those skills, and we experience success, then we get a sense of prestige and accomplishment. And then that charges up our battery because it triggers positive chemical reactions. And then we're fully charged. And then we can reach what Maslow and his colleagues referred to as self-actualization. Self-actualization is just a fancy way to say critical and creative thinking skills, or those cognitive skills that we want to develop. And those skills are identified in Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy includes cognitive skills such as remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And so the top of Maslow's pyramid, self-actualization, is also Bloom's taxonomy. And so if we want to develop cognitive critical thinking skills, such as understanding, applying, and analyzing, it's important that we meet Maslow needs first. And that's why we want to assess Maslow needs, just like we assess critical thinking and literacy needs. And we want to fill in the deficiencies in the Maslow hierarchy, just like we want to fill in the deficiencies in the Bloom's or the academic hierarchy. And so when in doubt, when we personally are not feeling fully charged, or our students are drained and stressed and overwhelmed, we want to always assess the Maslow needs and fill those in, because those are the things that trigger positive chemical reactions and charge up our battery in our brain so that we have the capacity to learn new skills and also demonstrate those new skills. And so when we understand that our brains, especially the young brain, is highly influenced by the environment, we have to make sure and meet those Maslow needs in order to increase success. Okay, so we have talked about how the young brain is different. There is an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. We have talked about how the brain, especially the young brain, is highly influenced by environment, and that's why you got a Maslow before you bloom is so important for us to keep in mind. And finally, let's talk about that last principle. Success is not by chance, but by design. So here are 7 strategies for us to use to meet needs and build those Bloom cognitive, social, emotional skills. All right. The first is start your lesson with a community building, relationship building, stress decreasing strategy, such as telling a funny joke or story, or playing games such as This or That, 3 Truths and a Lie, or Rose and Thorn, which is, it's a gratitude game. Identify 3 roses or things that you are thankful for, and 1 thorn or thing that is troubling you. All of those community and relationship building strategies are a great way to increase social, emotional, and cognitive skills in your students. Now, if you really want to bloom those cognitive critical thinking skills, consider implementing an essential question that clarifies the learning objective for the student so that they're not wasting cognitive energy trying to figure out, what am I supposed to be learning during this lesson? Essential questions can be easily answered or Googleable and definitive, if you will. For example, how can I solve a linear equation? Or they can be more debatable and ungoogleable, if you will, such as what is the meaning to life? Either way, it's okay to switch which types of essential questions and how complex they are on a daily or weekly basis. So start with an essential question to clarify the learning objective. Another important strategy to implement to increase social, emotional, and cognitive critical thinking skills is prediction. Throughout your lesson, stop and have students make a prediction based on what they just read. What do they think is going to happen next? Or maybe looking at a picture, make a guess as to what the picture has to do with the lesson. Another strategy to use is retell. Retell is a chronological order processing strategy that is very effective for the young brain. So retell is first, then finally. So stop periodically and ask students to identify first what they read or learned, then, and then finally. Another strategy to utilize is summarize. A summary, some teachers use retell and summary interchangeably, but they're actually different skills. So summary is answering the reporter's questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. That's another great skill to build social, emotional, and cognitive success. You can also have students sketch a picture of what comes to mind as you're reading this scene. Sketch a picture of the process that we are learning about. For example, sketching the water cycle. Sketching is extremely powerful for increasing those cognitive skills. Another strategy to encourage engagement and social, emotional, cognitive skill development is choice. Whenever possible, give students a choice. In fact, you might train them in 5 or 10 critical thinking strategies, such as prediction, retell, and summarize, and then give them the choice. Which one do they want to stop and use right here during this lesson? And then finally, because learning is it's a circular cycle, if you will, whatever you start with, be sure to come back with at the end. And so if you start with your essential question, be sure to cycle back at the end and give students an opportunity to formulate an answer based on what they learned to the essential question to help cement that knowledge in their brains. If you want to increase social, emotional, and cognitive skills in your students, consider Maslow and blooming your lessons by following this simple formula. Start your lesson with a Maslow relationship and community building strategy, such as a funny joke, playing fun games such as this or that, 3 truths and a lie, or rose and thorn. And then increase their Bloom's cognitive and critical thinking skills by identifying the essential question, asking them to make predictions, periodically having them stop and retell first, then finally what they've learned. Summarize, answer those important reporters' questions: who, what, when, where, why, how. Sketch. Whenever possible, provide choice. That gives students a sense of ownership over their learning. And finally, because learning is a circular cycle, whatever you start with, come back to in the end to end with. So always revisit your essential question and allow students to formulate an answer to the essential question using the information that they learned. So what happened to Brian, my 8th grade student who wanted my help in going from feeling like he sucked to becoming more successful? Well, he continued to struggle social, emotionally, and cognitively throughout his school years. And we were working on a variety of skills that increased his success, but he couldn't quite get the breakthrough that he really was looking for. And sometimes we have students like that. And it's important for us to understand it's not an effort issue. And so when I told him just try a little bit harder, neurologically speaking, sometimes that's impossible for us to do sometimes, especially when we are stressed and drained and we're not getting our Maslow needs met. And so Brian went on to struggle in high school. He got into a fight. He got kicked out of high school, and he got into another fight and ended up in jail for a couple of months. And then I lost track of him until a couple of years ago when I ran into him at a restaurant. I was at a restaurant sitting at a very loud, chatty table with several colleagues, and across the restaurant, this big, large, strong, menacing looking young man, he stands up and he shouts out to me, "Yo, Mrs. Adams!" And he gets up and he starts walking toward me. And as he gets closer, I get a little bit nervous because I'm not sure who it is. And then as he gets closer, I realize, oh, wow, it's Brian, one of those students that I struggled with and he struggled, and I couldn't quite get through to him. And I've always felt like I failed him. So as he gets closer, I'm feeling a little bit nervous in seeing him. And he says, Mrs. Adams, do you remember me, Brian? You had me several years back in 8th grade. And I said, yeah, Brian, how are you? And he said, well, Mrs. Adams, first of all, I just want to apologize. I was kind of a jerk to you. I always challenged you. I always argued with you. I really struggled academically, and I know you did everything you could to help me. And but I want to let you know that everything has turned out okay for me. You probably heard that I got into a fight and I was in jail for a couple of months. And I said, yeah, how are you? How's everything turned out? He said, well, it is true. I got out of jail. All the charges were dropped. I enrolled in the military and I received a lot of training, and I was able to establish good friendships. I got my basic needs met. He's talking about his Maslow needs. And he was able to develop a lot of skills. He said, I was trained as a frontline medic, and I personally saved 19 guys' lives. And I'm now out. I'm the assistant manager of one of the large stores here in the area. I'm married. We're expecting our first child. I work with veterans. I work with troubled youth. I try to just give back because I struggled so much and I caused so many troubles when I was younger that I want to help others be successful. And he said, but Mrs. Adams, I want to tell you something. He said, you saved my life. And I thought, what? What are you talking about? And he said, well, one day I was absent, and the next day I got to your class, and there you were standing at the door, and you were smiling and saying hello to all of us. And when you got to me, you stopped me and said, Brian, where were you yesterday? I'm so glad you're back. And he said, it kind of stopped me in my track because I never really had anyone say that to me before, because I was such a pain. But he said, Mrs. Adams, I want to tell you, I was absent the day before because I tried to commit suicide. And just like everything else at that time, I failed at it. But I told myself that night, if you go to school tomorrow and anybody notices that you were gone, that'll be like a special message to myself never to do that again. And he said, there you were, Mrs. Adams, at the end of the day, probably the last adult that I saw for the rest of the day. There you were, and you said, you're so glad I was back. And he said, I don't know if you said that to everybody. He said, but you said that to me today. And he said, Mrs. Adams, out of all the strategies and all the things that you tried to help me with, he said, I want you to know, if you ever question whether or not you make a difference in students' lives, you do. And you were created for such a time as this. And you were there that day to communicate to me and extend a little bit of grace and love to me and compassion to me that I really needed. And so I tell that story about Brian, not because I felt really successful while I was working with him. In fact, while I was working with him, I often struggled thinking, what else can I do? Not all of these strategies seem to work with him. And we always seem to have a couple of Brians on our class list. But can I just encourage you that Brian is there for a reason? And you might just be planting those skills that Brian will be using much later. And when in doubt, just remember, you got a Maslow before you bloom. And so just continue to make connections and build positive relationships with your students because you were created for such a time as this. Now, based on what we learned today, how would you answer the essential question, how does the young brain differ from the mature brain? And what are 7 strategies to skyrocket social, emotional, cognitive skills? I'll give you a couple seconds to jot down a few ideas.